Hello and welcome. We have with us today Dr. Satyajit Rath from National Institute of Immunology. We are going to discuss the controversy arising out of the BT Brinjal case. Satyajit, as you know, this has become highly controversial, first because of the nature of the clearances given. There have been questions that have been raised on it. It has been, of course, part of a much larger controversy on GM foods as well as GM crops itself. Coming to the first question, what do you think is the nature of the controversy that has come out with respect to the clearances? Do you think the clearances were faulty, the regulatory process is weak? What do you think of this?
That's the most specific question. And obviously, both in the press as well as behind the scenes, there have been claims and counterclaims, a veritable welter of them. The problem with that is that in the first place, India's regulatory processes and their implementation has been traditionally weak. We have the same problem with the drug control authorities. We have the same problems in any regulatory implementation. The second is the nature of the data. The problem is at that level that we are talking about safety and related data on a marketable product which is being generated as evidence by a vested interest, by the company itself. And immediately the question arises, is this believable? Is this credible? How honest is it? And so on and so forth. Once again, those are valid questions, but they become part of a larger argument because that's exactly what we do with drugs. That's not simply something we do with GM crops. It is possible to argue, as people like me do, that this is inappropriate and that we actually need public domain trials for this. But that goes to the very heart of private sector driven, profit driven, ownership and monopoly driven market expansions, and therefore becomes part of a larger political discourse.
Coming back to the larger issue of the GM crops, as you know, there has been a lot of resistance to GM crops itself. Now, in terms of the future, it does appear that the next developments that we are going to see in agriculture would probably come from GM, genetically modified organisms. And particularly if we have GM coming in different countries. It's now almost 10-15 years that GM crops are around. Do you think that the argument against GM crops being kept out completely is any more a valid one?
So let me clarify first. While I agree with you that genetically modified crops are going to be a component of our future agriculture, I don't by any means think that that's the only or even necessarily the overwhelmingly dominant mode that we are going to see. We are going to see a whole plethora of alterations in agricultural practices and in agricultural technologies. They will range from organic through sustainable, through completely alternative modes of agriculture, and will include GM as one of the many arrows in the quiver, so to say. And I don't think that therefore our agricultural future is a one-horse race by any means. That said, I think that GM crops will be a major factor in future agriculture. And while there are certainly legitimate issues around genetic modification of crops, primarily to do with the fact that it's an abrupt modification rather than a gradual modification, which is what nature normally introduces, it is possible to overstate the risks involved. Equally, it's not difficult to imagine good practices in risk containment in the GM crop arena. And therefore, I don't think that there is anything intrinsically unacceptable about GM crops. We do need to make a case-by-case determination of risk. We do in all technology categories. But that's the nature of the technological beast. I don't think anything beyond that is needed. There is, however, a fundamental issue with what kind of genetic modification we are using. And there, the current GM is in a certain sense an example of doing the silly thing and doing it for profit. This is not to say that I think that the current GM crops, which are almost invariably either herbicide or pest resistant are useless at being herbicide or pest resistant. They function insofar as they do. But all of those are interventions that in the very nature of the pest and crop cycle will invite the generation of resistant pests. Effectively, therefore, BT is a technology with built-in obsolescence because pests will develop resistance. There's a whole lot of technical conversation that goes on about how one can avoid the generation of pest resistance for a variety of reasons. It would take too long to go into technicalities, but for a variety of reasons, in marginal agricultural areas, it's impossible to implement those kinds of solutions, and therefore resistance is going to be generated. On the other hand, salinity tolerant crops, crops which don't go rancid,
drought resistant
crops, all of these are not crops whose utility will have a small time window, and yet we don't generate those. We don't put those out into the market. What we put out into the market is this extremely short period utility, extremely high monetary return utility kind of crops, and that's to do fundamentally with who owns them.
So effectively what you are saying is that GM, yes, but we need a lot of regulatory practices in order to test for the risks of such products. Coming back to the last issue on the GM crops, it has also become a monopoly of a few multinational corporations. In fact, most of the GM crops today are really controlled by only a few companies, including, of course, the most important one, Monsanto. Now, this therefore raises the risk that the seeds of various countries could be controlled by a few global corporations, and then we enter into a situation of complete dependency. Now, as it has been always recognized, food security is politically the most important issue for every country, and this would in fact be a danger to food security as well. So do you think that if we have to allow GM, that you really relook at this aspect of ownership of the technology?
The problem with GM crops is not GM, but Monsanto. This is not to paint Monsanto as a particularly evil devil, but simply to point out that large transnational for-profit approaches of this kind almost invariably lead to the situation that we are in. As I said earlier, to make a choice when making GM crops to deal with pest resistance rather than nutritional improvement or hardiness itself is a very commercially oriented decision. That's not really the best one that you would have made if you were thinking food security. Exactly similarly, not to allow true breeding GM so that you can control seed flow is also a commercial decision that is not in consonance with food security. These are all decisions that are made by the transnational private ownership of these technologies, and these are very sweepingly owned technologies. It's extremely hard to generate independent GMs without these technologies. Although there are now open source alternatives, they haven't been optimized to the point where they can be easily resulting in interesting GM crops. Also, the kind of regulatory investment that gets needed, only the profit-making transnationals seem to be making the effort. As a matter of fact, it's amazing that, to me at least, that governments do not seem to be making the effort to take public sector generated GM crops that are nutritionally enhanced, that are hardihood enhanced, and put them through the regulatory grill into the marketplace. It's absolutely extraordinarily amazing and depressing that that is the case. And that says that we are actually resigned as a state, as a society, to company control of genetically modified foods. And I find that an extraordinary position for us to
and also of agriculture as a whole then. But
now,
Satyajit, that is an interesting point, because GM in India, BT cotton for instance, was selling at about 4 times the price of seeds as it was in China, where the monopoly of Monsanto did not exist.
Absolutely.
So it's really, if you allow multinationals to control your agriculture, you're really putting your peasantry as well as your food security at risk.
Completely. Now, let me add a point. This is again not simply an isolated case of GM crops being controlled by transnational food companies. As a general phenomenon the world over, particularly in countries where agriculture is not small marginal farmer driven but is large farm driven, the great food corporations, the Archer Daniel Midlands, the Monsantos, these are the companies that are beginning to dominate agriculture in general, not simply as GM foods. So that the GM crop control by the large transnationals is only one part of the larger domination of global agriculture.
Except it's now coming into countries like India and the third world. Thanks a lot, Satyajit. I think that's been a very interesting discussion. We'll come back on this, I'm sure, again.